I'm a pastor. I'm called to preach the gospel. So what do I do when one of my members comes to me with a story like this? So he's driving on the highway. He gets rear-ended by another driver. They both pull over. And the person that hit him was a young lady, and she's begging him, don't call the police. But he wanted to call the police and handle it the proper way to make sure his car would get fixed, and if there's any injuries, it would all officially be reported. So the cop arrived, and instead of coming to him, the cop immediately went to her and talked to her for several minutes. Now, when the officer finally came to him, instead of asking him if he's okay and asking him anything about the accident, he promptly said, give me your license and registrations. So he started to walk towards his vehicle to get it from the glove compartment. He noticed that the officer was following him. So he wanted to be transparent, and he told him that he had a license to carry. He had a weapon in the vehicle, in the glove compartment, in the same place where his license and registration was. So he requested that the officer get it for him. But the officer insisted, no, you need to get it yourself. So as he reached into the car, he now noticed the officer on the passenger side of the car, and his gun is drawn. So he stopped and asked the officer, like, what are you doing? And the officer said, just get your license and don't do anything stupid. Now, by this time, his heart is pounding out of his chest, and he told the officer he was afraid for his life. But the officer again told him, just get your license, don't do anything stupid. So in that moment, he's wondering, is he going to end up another victim of police murder? If he's going to end up just another statistic or just another hashtag. See, this young man was African American. The woman that hit him was white. The police officer was white. He called the police. He was the victim in the accident. But the officer arrived and instead looked at him as the threat. So what do you do when you hear a story like that? You listen and you lament. I want to talk to you for a few minutes today about how systemic bias favors whiteness. My name is Tommy Urban D. Kyllonen. I'm originally from Philly, but I've been down in Tampa, Florida for a few decades. I serve as the lead pastor at Crossover Church. And our church is multi-ethnic, multi-generational, multi-class. And so we've been having these kind of conversations for years. So what is systemic bias? Well, bias is our personal outlook that can sometimes be skewed or prejudiced. And so systemic bias is a process that supports that particular outcome. And in this case, we're talking about how it favors white people. But why? Let's go to the why. So in 1 John chapter 2, starting in verse 7, John, he writes about a new commandment. And he says it's not really new. We've been told to love one another from the very beginning. But now we've had the example to watch Jesus really live it out. And so we're trying to follow that. So verse 11 says this. It says, but anyone who hates a brother or sister is in darkness and walks around in the darkness. They do not know where they're going because the darkness has blinded them. So that one verse mentions darkness 3 times. Hatred, it blinds our eyes, it stops our ears, it hardens our heart, paralyzes our reasoning and our intelligence. Now, there's some leaders watching this right now, and I know that maybe you had some hatred towards other people that look different than you at some point in your life. You may have had a bad experience with someone that caused you to judge everyone that looked like that person. Now, even if that's not you, you know what? All of us, we lead some people that may have some hate in their heart towards others. And this year has brought out that hate, that blindness, that darkness more than ever, right? I mean, the division over race issues and politics and over COVID and over should we reopen our church? And it's been ugly. And let's be real, y'all, it's been exhausting. But at the same time, it's been eye-opening in many ways. And you know what? Our biases have been more exposed. Now, I grew up in a diverse environment. I lead in a diverse environment, so I've been very aware and sensitive to how systemic bias favors whiteness. Most of my friends, my staff, my elders, and my congregation are people of color. So I'm regularly exposed to injustice and things they experience, like that opening story that I shared. Now, technically, I'm white. My father was Finnish. That's why I got a funky last name. But my mom was Greek. And so to many people, I don't really look white. Many times I'm assumed that I'm Hispanic and I've been treated differently at different points. When I travel, I'm regularly profiled as Middle Eastern. And I've watched people that look white walk right by, but I was stopped. I was searched. I've even been detained for several hours in some instances. So bias is real. Now, when we saw the videos of George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery, it broke our hearts. For some people, it was a wake-up call. When they finally acknowledged, like, we have a problem. Many churches actually addressed this for the very first time from their pulpits this year, or their virtual pulpits, right? Some of them got some pushback. But for other people, it was just a replay of what they've been experiencing their whole lives, and the pain cut even deeper. See, guys, there's systems all around us of bias that favors white people over people of color, and it's not just with law enforcement. When I pick up the Business Journal here from my city and I read articles and I see about the new startups getting funding and they're welcoming the new CEOs and CFOs and people that are getting new top executive positions, I always notice something that bothers me. You know what? It's usually all white people. In a city that's over 50% minorities, there's barely any representation of people of color in the top business community. Now, I know people could come up with a list of reasons why, well, there weren't enough qualified people of color to fill those type of positions, but let's look at the root why. Systems and policies have been in place for generations that have held some of our brothers and sisters back. We got to acknowledge that. So what are some of those systems in your community? I want you to talk about it at your table in the next few minutes. Systemic bias, it favors whiteness in law enforcement, in business, but also in education and finances. And I could go on and on with examples, but the last one I want us to focus on is us. Us, the church. Let's be real. That systemic bias that we're talking about, it is spilled over into the church. And if you study real American church history, there are many things to lament about. Now, although we've made progress, Sunday morning is still the most segregated hour in our nation. And I could give you lots of examples, but a current one that also bothers me is that although most large American cities are now made up of predominantly majority minorities, we see most new church plants happening in the suburbs or only in the gentrifying whiter neighborhoods of those cities. Now, I know many of those decisions, they're based on economics, but again, it supports that systemic bias favors whiteness. So what do? Now that the blindness is being lifted, the light is being shined in on the darkness. And here we are at the most influential Christian leadership conference in the world, and we're having this conversation as the central focus. And you're here, and you have influence, you have platform, you have power. Many of us, we have privilege. We need to take honest inventory. How have we been possibly contributing to some of these systemic biases? If we put the spotlight on our own lives, our own family, our church, our staff, our network, what can we change? Who can we invite into our circle that looks different than us? Who can we listen to? Who can we lament with? Who can we stand up for in our community that doesn't have a voice? Because you have a voice. You have influence. And collectively, the thousands of us that are part of this conference, as we collaborate with people that are different than us, as we come together in unity and we fulfill Jesus' prayer from John 17, you know what? We can heal our land. And I long for the day I won't have to have people of color coming to me sharing another story of injustice. Let me leave you with this. Systemic bias favors whiteness. For many years, some of us tried to fight this. We said it doesn't exist. Well, you could go on the internet and find anything to validate your list. And that right there could be biased itself. But Jesus said to love your neighbor as you love yourself. But what if your neighbor looks different? Even before COVID, there was social distance. See, we might befriend Bob quicker than we get to know Tyrone. And skin color alone can many times determine whether having a conversation versus just hello. But we have this great commission to go. This great commandment to love. John chapter 17, Jesus' last prayer before he spilled his blood. He prayed for the thing that can heal our nation. The way that there could be true transformation when the capital C church gets together for the great collaboration.